I have lived in the same house for 11 years. I bought it myself, with money I saved over a decade of working double shifts at the hospital and living on rice and beans in a studio apartment so small that my bed was also my couch. I refinished the floors myself. I painted every room twice because I got the color wrong the first time in the kitchen, and I didn't care because it was mine to get wrong. I planted the roses along the front fence from cuttings my grandmother gave me the summer before she passed. That house is not just property to me. It is the physical proof that I survived everything that tried to break me. So when Gerald Marsh moved in next door and decided that my survival was an inconvenience to him, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Gerald arrived 3 years ago in the spring. He was recently divorced, or so the neighbors told me, and he had bought the house next door as a fresh start. I remember the first time I saw him, he was standing in his driveway watching the movers with his arms crossed, barking instructions, and never once helping with anything heavy. I introduced myself over the fence, and he looked me up and down the way some men do, a slow, deliberate inventory, and then said, "Nice neighborhood," as if he were complimenting himself for choosing it. I smiled and went back inside and filed that first impression somewhere useful in my memory. For the first few months, things were manageable. Gerald was loud. He played music on weekend mornings at volumes that rattled my kitchen windows, the kind of classic rock that sounds aggressive even when it isn't, all crashing drums and overdriven guitars. He let his grass grow until the city would have cited him if I hadn't known from a friend on the code enforcement team that complaints needed to come in writing. He parked his truck with the back end jutting out over the sidewalk, which meant that Mrs. Alvarez from 3 houses down, who used a walker, had to go into the street to get around it. I knocked on his door about that one. He told me he'd move it when he felt like it and closed the door in my face. I want to be honest with you about something. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I spent years in conflict resolution training as part of my work in hospital administration, and I genuinely believe that most disputes can be solved by 2 adults sitting down and communicating clearly. I tried that with Gerald, more than once, more than was reasonable. I wrote him a friendly note about the music. I waved at him from the driveway and tried small talk. I brought over a plate of cookies at Christmas, which he accepted without comment and never acknowledged again. I was patient because I understood that divorce is hard, that new beginnings are disorienting, and that maybe Gerald was struggling in ways that made him prickly and defensive. I gave him the benefit of the doubt for almost a full year. The benefit of the doubt ran out on a Saturday in March, about 2 years ago. I had spent the morning in my garden, which is my sanctuary, the place where I go when the hospital has been brutal and the world feels like too much. I was on my knees in the rose bed along the shared fence line, working in new soil, and Gerald came out of his house, walked to the fence, stood over me, and told me that my roses were a problem. He said their roots were encroaching on his property and that he had the right to cut anything that crossed the property line. I sat back on my heels and looked up at him and asked, very calmly, what specifically was encroaching. He waved his hand vaguely and said had someone look and they'd confirmed it. I asked who. He said that wasn't my business. I told him that before either of us did anything, I'd like to get a survey done, so we both knew exactly where the line was. He said that was unnecessary because he already knew. I said I'd like to see documentation. He said, and I want you to remember these words because I wrote them down that same afternoon, I don't need documentation to do what I want on my own property. And I'd appreciate it if you kept your little hobby garden on your side of things. Little hobby garden. 11 years of work. Roses from my grandmother's cuttings. I went inside, washed my hands, sat at my kitchen table, and opened a new document on my laptop. I titled it Gerald Marsh, Incident Log. I dated the first entry, wrote down exactly what he had said, noted the time, and described the interaction in factual, unemotional language. I had no particular plan at that point. I was simply doing what my training had always told me to do when a situation feels like it might escalate. Document everything, stay calm, and prepare. Over the following weeks, Gerald escalated. He started leaving his garbage cans at the edge of the property line, blocking part of my driveway entrance on collection days. Not fully blocking it, just enough to be inconvenient, just enough that I'd have to angle my car awkwardly. When I mentioned it, he said he had nowhere else to put them. I measured the distance between his garage and the curb and calculated that he had more than enough room. I documented that too, with photographs. I had started photographing everything by then, time-stamped, stored in a cloud folder organized by date. My sister called me paranoid when I told her what I was doing. I told her I preferred the word prepared. The music got worse. He had apparently discovered that if he angled his outdoor speakers toward my house, the sound was nearly twice as disruptive on my side of the fence. I checked the municipal noise ordinance, which I found on the city's website in about 4 minutes. Amplified music outdoors was prohibited above 65 decibels between the hours of 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. and above 75 decibels at any time. I purchased a sound level meter for $32 on the internet. I recorded Gerald's speakers on a Sunday morning at 7:45 a.m. registering 81 decibels from inside my own kitchen with the window closed. I have that recording. I have the meter's calibration certificate. I have the time-stamped photos of the meter display. I filed my first noise complaint with the city in April. Gerald received a warning notice. That evening, he walked to the edge of our shared fence, waited until I was in my backyard, and said, loudly enough for me to hear clearly, "Some people need to mind their own business." I went inside, added the incident to the log, and watered my roses. I want to tell you about the roses specifically because that is where it really crossed a line. In June, on a Tuesday morning, I left for work at 6:30, as I always do. I came home at 5:40 in the afternoon and found that the roses along the shared fence had been cut. Not trimmed. Cut. They had been severed at the base, a clean cut with something sharp, loppers, or a reciprocating saw. 7 plants. 4 of them were from my grandmother's cuttings. They were in full bloom. They were on my side of the property line by at least 18 inches. I had the survey done 2 months earlier, and the stakes were still in the ground. He had come onto my property, or reached over the fence and across the line, and destroyed 11 years of cultivation and irreplaceable pieces of my grandmother's garden while I was at work saving people's lives. I sat down on my back step, and I cried. I am not ashamed of that. I cried for about 10 minutes, and then I wiped my face, went inside, and called my attorney. I had a real estate and property attorney because I am the kind of person who gets things in writing. Her name is Diane, and she has been my attorney since I bought the house. I described the situation, the survey, the cuts, the documentation I had compiled, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You have a civil claim for destruction of property. Depending on the value we can establish for those plants, you may also be looking at something worth pursuing in small claims or even district court. And if he crossed the property line to do this, that's trespass." I asked her what I should do first. She said, "Photographs. Police report. Don't speak to him." I took 47 photographs of the rose beds that evening. I documented the cut ends, the survey stakes, the distance between the fence line, and where the roses had stood. I called the non-emergency police line and filed a report for destruction of property and trespass. The officer, who came out, was thorough. He measured. He photographed. He noted the survey stakes. He asked if I knew who had done it, and I told him I had a strong suspicion and explained the history. He took Gerald's name. He knocked on Gerald's door. Gerald told him the roses had been crossing onto his property, and he had the right to cut them. The officer explained that the survey stakes suggested otherwise, that cutting vegetation that was demonstrably on another person's property was destruction of property, and that Gerald might want to speak with an attorney. Gerald apparently did not take that advice seriously, because 3 days later he left a handwritten note in my mailbox that said, "Your plants were trespassing. So were you when you called the cops over nothing. Watch yourself. Watch yourself." I put that note in a plastic bag, labeled it with the date, and added it to my files. I texted my attorney a photo of it. She texted back a single word: "Perfect." Here's something I have learned about bullies, not from any book or training, but from lived experience. They are almost always operating on the assumption that the other person has less stamina than they do. They escalate because they believe that eventually you will decide it isn't worth it. They are banking on your exhaustion. What Gerald did not know about me is that I once worked 36 consecutive hours during a crisis at the hospital, went home, slept 4 hours, and came back. I do not run out of stamina. I run out of patience, which is different, because when I run out of patience, I stop being kind about my thoroughness. I began researching Gerald. Not in any improper way. Everything I did was entirely through public records and observable fact. I discovered, through the county assessor's website, that Gerald had not paid his property taxes in full for the previous year and was carrying a balance with a penalty accruing. I noted this not because it was immediately useful, but because it told me something about his financial situation and his relationship with institutional authority. I checked the city's code enforcement database, which is publicly searchable, and found that the prior owner of Gerald's house had received citations for exactly the kind of fence and encroachment issues Gerald had been raising with me, which suggested Gerald may have bought the house, knowing there were unresolved boundary questions, and was attempting to resolve them at my expense. I filed that away. Through the neighborhood association, which Gerald had never joined, I learned that 2 other neighbors had complaints about him. The Pattisons on the other side of Gerald had experienced him backing his truck over the edge of their lawn repeatedly, leaving ruts, and when Mr. Patterson had mentioned it, Gerald had threatened to have their tree trimmed because it dropped leaves in his yard. The Kowalski family at the end of the block had caught Gerald letting his dog do its business on their lawn and not cleaning it up, twice captured on their doorbell camera. I introduced myself to both families properly, explained what I was dealing with, and asked if they would be willing to share their documentation if it ever became relevant. Both said yes. I added their contact information and a summary of their experiences to my file. Diane sent Gerald a formal letter in July. It outlined the destruction of property claim, cited the survey, referenced the police report, and demanded compensation for the value of the destroyed plants. Establishing the value of mature roses, particularly those with sentimental and horticultural provenance, is more complex than people expect. I had contacted a master gardener certified by the state extension program who agreed to provide a written assessment. She documented the age of the plants based on the rootstock remaining in the ground, their variety, their condition prior to destruction based on my photographs, and provided a replacement value that accounted not just for new plants, but for the years of growth that could not be replaced. Her assessment put the value at $4,400. Gerald's response to Diane's letter was a voicemail to my personal cell phone. I never discovered how he got my number, though I have a suspicion, in which he called the valuation ridiculous and said I could take him to court if I thought I was going to get a dime. We filed in district court in August. I want to tell you about the 2 months between filing and the hearing because they were not quiet months. Gerald, apparently informed by whatever legal advice he was getting that a preemptive offense might help him, began filing complaints about me with every municipal body he could identify. He filed a code enforcement complaint claiming my fence was over the height limit. It was not. I had the permit from when it was installed 8 years ago. He filed a complaint with the water department claiming I was violating irrigation restrictions. I was not. I had converted to drip irrigation 2 years prior specifically because of the restrictions and had documentation from the company that installed it. He filed a complaint with the HOA that I didn't belong to and was not subject to. He called the city arborist claiming a tree in my backyard was diseased and a hazard. The arborist came out, inspected the tree, found it healthy, and noted in her report that the complaint appeared to lack foundation. Every complaint was investigated. Every investigation closed in my favor. And every single one of those investigations generated a paper trail that I collected, organized, and added to what had by then become a very substantial file. My attorney looked at the volume of unfounded complaints and used a word I had been thinking but hadn't said out loud yet: harassment. She said we might want to consider whether an injunction was appropriate depending on how the property case resolved. The district court hearing was in October, on a gray Wednesday morning. I wore the same suit I wear when I give budget presentations to the hospital board. I brought a binder. It had tabs. Gerald showed up in jeans and a flannel shirt and sat at the opposing table looking at his phone until the judge came in. Gerald's position was that the roses had been encroaching on his property and he had acted within his rights as a property owner. His attorney, a young man who looked like he'd rather have been anywhere else, presented a printed map that Gerald had apparently made himself, without a surveyor, which contradicted the certified survey I had commissioned. The judge looked at Gerald's map, looked at the certified survey with the licensed surveyor's stamp and signature, and looked at Gerald's attorney with an expression that I can only describe as the face a teacher makes when a student has turned in work that was clearly done in the car on the way to school. I presented the survey. I presented the photographs documenting the location of the roses relative to the survey stakes. I presented the police report. I presented the master gardener's assessment. I presented my incident log, which by that point spanned 22 months and 73 individual entries. I presented the note he had left in my mailbox. Gerald's attorney objected to the note on relevance grounds. The judge overruled him and read the note slowly before setting it down on her desk. Gerald testified that the roots had been crossing the property line. His attorney asked him if he had documentation of that claim. He said he had had a friend look at it. The judge asked what the friend's qualifications were. Gerald said he was a landscaper. The judge asked if the landscaper had provided a written assessment. Gerald said no. The judge asked why not. Gerald said he hadn't thought it would come to this. The judge looked at him for a moment and then wrote something on her notepad. I testified about my grandmother. I had not planned to do that. Diane had coached me to stay factual and material, and I had every intention of doing exactly that, but when I was describing the roses, the specific variety, the history of the cuttings, the fact that those particular plants were the last living connection I had to a woman who had taught me to grow things when I was 7 years old, my voice did something unexpected, and the judge leaned forward slightly, and I simply told the truth. I told the truth about what those roses meant, and I watched the judge write something else on her notepad, and Gerald's attorney looked at his shoes. The judge ruled in my favor on all counts. She found that the roses had been on my property based on the certified survey, that Gerald had no legal basis for removing them, and that his actions constituted destruction of property and civil trespass. She awarded me the full $4,400 in the master gardener's assessment, plus court filing fees, plus a portion of my attorney fees, which she had the discretion to award given what she described as the frivolous nature of the defense. The total award was just over $6,000. She also issued a formal admonishment, which is part of the public court record, noting that Gerald's pattern of behavior as documented in my incident log and the record of unfounded complaints showed a pattern that the court found troubling. Gerald sat very still when she read the verdict. He didn't look at me. He looked at the table. Diane filed for the injunction the following week. Given the existing court record, the judge granted a limited harassment injunction requiring Gerald to cease filing complaints about my property without documented factual basis and prohibiting him from entering or reaching over the property line for any reason. Violations would be contempt of court. Gerald signed the acknowledgement of the injunction's terms in the courthouse parking lot, with his attorney standing beside him, on a cold November afternoon. I was not there for that. Diane sent me a photo of the signed document by text message, and I was at work when I got it, standing in the break room eating a sandwich, and I looked at that photo for a long time. Here is what happened next, and I tell you this not to gloat but because I think it matters. Gerald listed his house for sale in January. The listing went up quietly, no sign in the yard at first, just the online listing, but I saw it because I had set up an alert for his address. The house sold in March. I do not know where Gerald went. I don't need to know. What I know is that on the last Saturday of March, a moving truck came, and Gerald loaded his things into it over the course of a long afternoon, and at one point he was standing in the driveway, and I was in my front garden, planting new roses, and we looked at each other across the fence for a moment. I had ordered the new roses from a specialist nursery. They were grafted from heirloom stock, the same variety as the ones my grandmother had grown, the same ones Gerald had cut down. They were small, the way young roses are, bare cane and a few early leaves, full of potential that would take years to realize. I was on my knees in the soil, working in the amendments, doing the same thing I have always done, the slow, patient, unglamorous work of making something beautiful grow. Gerald looked at what I was doing for a moment. Then he got in his truck and drove away. I finished planting the last rows as the light was going gold and long across the yard. I pressed the soil down around the base of it the way my grandmother had taught me, firm but gentle, a specific pressure she had described once as enough to say you mean it. I washed my hands under the outdoor spigot and stood there for a minute in the evening air, looking at the row of new plants along the fence line, small and green and alive. 11 years ago, I bought this house with money I had saved one shift at a time. I built something here carefully, deliberately, with my own hands and my own patience, and a stubbornness that some people mistake for softness because it is quiet. Gerald Marsh looked at me and saw someone who would eventually decide it wasn't worth it.
He was wrong about that.
He was wrong about the roses.
He was wrong about me.
The new roses will bloom next spring. I will be there to see it.